Hello, welcome to your own channel, Curious Corners in Biology, where we discuss the aspect of curiosity in the subject of biology, where we venture into unanswered areas in this subject by answering ifs, hows, buts, whens, and whys of this subject. Okay, so today we will be continuing with respiratory physiology, and I have come up with more questions to discuss with. So let's start. Hope you can see my screen. Yeah. So the first question is that why is breathing in water difficult than in air? Okay. So this seems a simple question, but then we also know that there are aquatic creatures, aquatic organisms which can breathe. And there are, of course, terrestrial animals which can breathe. So are the two types of breathing different? Is one more energetically expensive than the other? Yes, because the first reason is water is viscous. If water is viscous, then the density of water is more than the density of air. So we know that for any kind of gaseous exchange to occur, there is a requirement of respiratory surface. So in a dense environment, water being a dense medium, simply it would require more energy for water to pass on to the respiratory surface. And until and unless water does not pass through the respiratory surface, how can gaseous exchange take place? So more energy will be required due to water being denser for the water to pass over the respiratory surface. This is not the problem with air. Air is quite thin than water. Air is quite less dense than water. So air can breeze over or pass over the respiratory surface very easily. So less energy is required. So of course, less amount of oxygen is available for organisms living in water as compared to terrestrial organisms. So of course, breathing in water is difficult, it is energetically more expensive, and the amount of dissolved oxygen in water is also less as compared to the oxygen which is present in air. So I hope this answers this simple question. The next question is, does a respiratory tract have some mechanism to replace dead cells? So, respiratory tract in a broader sense would include the broader airways and the smaller airways which are present in the lungs. Okay, so the broader airways will be bronchus and they will divide into finer branches which are called as bronchioles. So, of course, this respiratory tract is lined by respiratory epithelium. So, just like any other epithelium in the body, does respiratory epithelium have a mechanism to replace its dead cells? Because cells would die everywhere. Of course, there is a mechanism, and the cells involved in this are called as Clara cells. So, Clara cells are more or less like reservoir cells, or they may also be called functioning similar to stem cells. So these cells can regenerate or differentiate into cells of respiratory epithelium or the cells which are lining the bronchial epithelium. Okay. And Clara cells also have other functions, like they also secrete a surfactant, and surfactant reduces the surface tension along the respiratory tract. That means reduces the surface tensions of the water molecules to ease out the flow of liquids. Okay, because this is very important. If the surface tension in the respiratory tract is not low, then edema can take place because water will tend to accumulate more in the respiratory passages if there is no surfactant. Surfactant reduces the surface tension, so it makes the water molecule into a thin film so that they can easily be spread out along the respiratory tract, and this also helps to keep the respiratory tract moist. Also, cells of Clara are known to modulate the immune response again by producing surfactant. Like the surfactant which is produced by Clara cells would interact with toll like receptors of the immune system of the body and prevent the toll like receptors to express inflammatory molecules within the respiratory tract. So, in a way, it also reduces inflammation. So, of course, the respiratory tract can rebuild and replenish its cells. Okay, let's move on to the next question. How can mammals eat and breathe simultaneously? Now, again, this question appears very simple, but then if something is forced inside, whatever components are present into that thing will enter together. Okay, so if that is the case, then the food we eat when we are breathing at the same time should all go into lungs. Okay, if air is forced in, okay, and at the same time we are eating food, then if there is a forcing mechanism for the food to get in and for the air to get in, then both would enter trachea, right? But this is not the case, and of course if this happens then the person will die. What is the case? Food enters into esophagus and air enters into trachea. Of course, that we know that we have soft palate separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity, and we have epiglottis, okay, which is closing when we are swallowing so that food can enter esophagus. But then there is one more mechanism which is the most important, which allows mammals to eat and breathe simultaneously, and the mechanism is called negative pressure breathing. Okay, how do we breathe? Now, see, inhalation is due to the negative pressure of air which builds inside the lungs. So, the atmospheric pressure tries to equilibrate with the negative pressure, and the air is sucked inside. So air is not pushed forcefully into the lungs. In fact, air is sucked within the lungs. And this is what we call it as inhalation or inspiration. So while we are eating, we can breathe. And of course, inspiration will drive expiration because due to the partial pressure difference, of course, when oxygen gets in due to the high atmospheric pressure and that translating into filling up of the lungs, then CO2 simultaneously also escapes out of the lungs. So there is exhalation as well. So there is gaseous exchange occurring and there is breathing occurring simultaneously as we are eating. That is the reason. The main reason is negative pressure breathing. Then again, this is an interesting question that what is minimal volume of lungs and what is its clinical significance? So minimal volume of lungs is simply the threshold volume before the lungs collapse entirely or totally. That means you can say at the point of complete collapse of lungs, when there is no air in the lungs, just few seconds before that, whatever air is remaining in the lungs is called as minimal volume. And mind it that minimal volume is different from the residual volume. Residual volume is the normal volume of the air which remains in lungs after forceful exhalation. So, of course, residual volume is a part of normal breathing, but minimal volume is not a part of normal breathing. Okay. Now, of course, minimal volume of lungs shows that a baby which was born died after death. See, there are two cases, a stillbirth, which is a baby born dead, and there is a baby which can die after death due to multiple reasons. Okay, so how to determine that the baby was alive or how to determine that it was a stillbirth? So, in case of stillbirth, there will be no volume of air in lungs. Lungs would be absolutely airless. This is also to say there would be no minimal volume. But the right parameter to determine whether the baby was born alive or dead is residual volume. Because, of course, residual volume, if it is present in lungs, then the baby was born living and it died after birth. Because such lungs, when kept in water, would float. A residual volume, that is the volume of air inside the lungs, would help the lungs to float in water. So, of course, it has clinical significance, but minimal volume is not sufficient enough to confirm this test. So, residual volume is a better parameter for this. Then next question is, how does an increase in blood CO2 concentration cause an increase in the rate of CO2 diffusion into the cerebrospinal fluid? Okay. So first of all, cerebrospinal fluid is present in the ventricles of the brain and it is present in the neural canal of the spinal cord. And cerebrospinal fluid is formed by a network of blood capillaries having fenestrations. That means they are porous. And these network of blood capillaries or network of blood vessels, fine ones, is called as choroid plexus. And choroid plexus would simply filter the plasma out of the blood. Large protein molecules are left outside. Only minerals, ionic molecules, ions, and water are filtered, and a fluid which is formed, the filtrate, is called as the cerebrospinal fluid. So, if cerebrospinal fluid is formed out of blood, then if CO2 concentration is high in blood, the same CO2 is going to be present in the cerebrospinal fluid. In the cerebrospinal fluid, CO2 will combine with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is highly unstable, and when it dissociates into H plus and HCO3 minus. H plus concentration will increase, which will decrease the pH of cerebrospinal fluid. So this is an indicator that blood CO2 is also high if the CO2 concentration in cerebrospinal fluid has increased, because that is shown by low pH in the cerebrospinal fluid. The last interesting question which I would like to discuss, and this is the interesting question of the day, is how does diving bell spider respire and why it does respire through this mechanism, which we are going to discuss. This is a very interesting case. So spider usually are terrestrial insects. I mean terrestrial arthropods to be more specific, and they are not belonging to the phylum Insecta. They are arachnoids. Okay. So spiders are basically invertebrates. So spiders would usually have a tracheal system and spiracles to take care of its respiratory needs. Spiracles are openings outside the body which will help the air to be driven inside, and the tracheal system is the network of tubules on the dorsal and ventral side of the body of cockroach to allow the air to diffuse and oxygenate the capillaries and the hemolymph. Okay. But this is a case of aquatic spider. And from the name diving bell spider, that means the spider spends most of its time in aquatic condition. This is what it means. So there is an alternative name to this spider. This is also called as scuba spider. This is also called scuba spider. Now, this spider, you might think that it might have gills for breathing, but it does not have gills for breathing. Okay, because usually aquatic animals do. Does it have book lungs for exchange of gases? Yes. But is book lung the only mechanism available for the spider for gaseous exchange? No. There needs to be supply of air for the air to pass over book lungs. Otherwise, what is the meaning of having book lungs? Book lungs are respiratory membranes, are thin folded respiratory membranes or respiratory lamellae, which can allow air to pass through, which can also allow water to pass through. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this Cuba spider, because it's a diving spider, is that if you see, this is how the spider looks. Now, first of all, spider has the ability to weave a web of silk. So what does it do? It weaves silk when it is inside the water. And it also entangles some of the strands of the silk with the aquatic plants so that the silk threads are fastened to the aquatic plants and they will not get lost. Now, this silk threads will also help the spider to be guided to the surface of water. Now, what happens at the surface of water is that the legs of the spider would have fine hairs onto it. These fine hairs are water repelling and they have the ability to form an air bubble. So every time spider climbs up the water surface, through its legs, through the fine hairs on present on the legs of the fiber, it is going to trap an air bubble. And not one air bubble, many such air bubbles are trapped onto the fine hairs which are present on the legs of this spider. So you can see that the hairs are hydrophobic. So if it is hydrophobic, then the water film will remain away from the air, and the air is present inside the water film so that the air bubble is formed. Okay. So you can see how this spider is forming an entire bubble housing air, and this is formed due to a meshwork of silk which is in fact woven by the spider itself. Okay, so this is how it looks. Okay, so now from this air bubble, this air from the air bubble is driven to the book lungs, and the spider is able to carry out the gaseous exchange. That means it is able to breathe. Okay. Now what happens is that oxygen will be diffused out. So the concentration of oxygen will keep on increasing and the concentration of oxygen would keep on decreasing as time passes inside this diving bell. This diving bubble or the air bubble is also called as diving bell. Okay. And the volume of the bell also keeps on shrinking because nitrogen is also trapped, okay, inside this bubble, but then nitrogen gradually diffuses out. So there is a mechanism that this air bubble will also shrink with passage of time. Okay. Whether this air bubble shrinks with passage of time, it does. But even more important to understand is that after about a day, the spider has to again climb up to the water surface to trap more air bubbles and create this diving bell again. But anyway, a spider can survive with this diving bell or diving bubble for a day or more, depending on its activity. Okay, if the spider is more active, then the oxygen would run out very soon inside the diving bell. Okay, so this is a very is a marvel of nature, is a miracle of nature, that how arthropods do not need to evolve gills in order to breathe. Because if had they evolved gills, then it would require a complete overhaul of the respiratory and the circulatory system, which is not possible for an invertebrate. Okay, so this is the reason, and this is a very incredible creature, which is a marvel of breathing. Okay, so that much for today, and I hope you have enjoyed the session. We will be discussing more such questions in the upcoming discussions. And if you are interested in such content, please do not forget to subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon. And I have written a book, Curious Corners in Biology, which is available at on Amazon in ebook format. So this will be available on Kindle store, but Kindle is easily available on Android devices and iOS systems as well. So you can definitely buy the book. It is available at a very affordable price. The interesting thing about the book is that it will open the perception of curious and inquisitive and young learners in the subject of biology, that how this subject is not just a matter of rote learning, and how this subject is very scientific, okay, and very mysterious as well. There are questions which are still unanswered in biology, okay, but we will be discussing what can be answered, which is not usually given in the textual content of the literature which we usually read in biology. So thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.